Welcome back to part 2 of my lecture series on the foundations of bioethics. Part 2 of this series focuses on primary ethical theories relevant to bioethics. For each ethical theory, I will begin with an overview of the theory, discuss the individuals or groups who were instrumental in developing the theory, explain how the theory responds to the three big questions of ultimate reality, human nature, and the role of God in ethics. I will end with a summary of the main points of the theory, along with what are generally considered the positive aspects of the theory, as well as the limitations that the theory presents. Remember, all the ethical theories we are discussing in this course are still applied in practice today because they all contain a nugget of truth. However, all of these theories fall short of being normative for one reason or another. As you go through the theories, I encourage you to consider for yourself what nuggets of truth do you take away from the theory, and where does this theory fall short for you? In this lecture, we're going to look at utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. Consequentialism falls under the category of theological ethical theories, meaning the morality of an action is judged based on the outcome of the action. Following this lecture, you should be able to summarize the foundational concepts of utilitarianism, discuss how Aristotle, Bentham, and Mill all contributed to the development of utilitarianism, describe how utilitarianism answers the questions of ultimate reality, human nature, and God's role in ethics, and identify two positive aspects and two potential problems with utilitarianism as an ethical theory. Utilitarianism is a form of hedonistic ethics. Hedonism is the idea or the theory that the good that people seek in life is happiness or pleasure. In this sense, happiness is not an emotion or an immediate feeling, but rather it's an intellectual, spiritual, social, physical, emotional, holistic sense of overall well-being. Happiness is the ultimate goal of humans according to utilitarianism, and therefore happiness is the true standard by which goodness is judged, because acts that are morally right are acts that bring about happiness. In other words, when the consequence or the outcome of an act is happiness, then the act is deemed moral. Under utilitarianism, the only thing that is evil in and of itself is pain, which is considered to be unhappiness. Another important tenet of utilitarianism is that no one individual's happiness is more valuable than another's. Under utilitarianism, everybody's happiness is equal. The focus should be on the general regard for everybody. Therefore, it is ethical under utilitarianism to sacrifice your own happiness for the greater good or the greater happiness of the greater number. The roots of utilitarianism can be traced back to the Greek philosopher Aristotle. As a philosopher, Aristotle postulated that our actions tell us about what we truly want. Everything that we choose for the sake of something else, except happiness, which is an end. In other words, every choice we make is an attempt to reach something even greater. But the greatest goal that we are aspiring for is happiness. Therefore, Aristotle concluded that happiness is the only thing that has intrinsic value. However, Aristotle is not classified as a utilitarian. Utilitarianism is not the ethical theory that is attributed to Aristotle. However, Aristotle is mentioned here because the argument for happiness that Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, used is grounded in Aristotle's ethics and this idea from Aristotle that happiness is the only thing with intrinsic value. Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, was an English philosopher who proposed an Enlightenment theme as a secular basis for morality, rights, and social cohesion. If you recall, Enlightenment ethical themes were grounded in rationality and reason. Bentham wanted to quantify ethics because when you can quantify something, then you can use mathematical theories and logics to calculate right and wrong. Bentham wanted to make ethics as logical as possible and thus universally understood. Therefore, he concluded that the purpose of morality was to maximize happiness, and the calculation or formula that he gave to identifying happiness was measured by contrasting levels of pain and pleasure. Therefore, right and wrong could be grounded in the outcomes and consequences of the amount of pain relative to the level of pleasure. Bentham termed this quantifiable understanding and calculation of right and wrong hedonistic calculus. If you recall, hedonism refers to the good or happiness that people seek. Thus, hedonistic calculus was a mathematical way of rationally calculating the morality of an action. According to Bentham, hedonistic calculus was universally applicable. For the calculation, Bentham identified 7 specific categories of happiness. Intensity. How intense or strong is this happiness? Duration. How long will the happiness last? Certainty. What is the probability or likelihood that the decision is going to occur and bring about happiness? Propinquity. How soon will the outcome bring about happiness? Fecundity. Is this happiness going to have a ripple effect and lead to other happiness? Purity. How pure is the happiness? What is the ratio of how much happiness to how much pain the action will bring about? And extent. How many people are going to be affected positively and negatively by the action? To perform the calculation, one must consider how much pleasure comes in each of these 7 categories, and then compare all of the possible actions and choose the action that produces the highest net happiness overall. And while this may work well for large choices, Bentham had indicated that hedonistic calculus could be universally applied in all situations and all occasions. So the limit of hedonistic calculus became the amount of mathematical calculation and analysis that would be required to make simple life day-to-day decisions. In other words, hedonistic calculus was impractical. Beyond just basic practicality, upon further investigation, we find hedonistic calculus has additional limitations that cause it to fall apart. Bentham failed to recognize that humans have both lower and higher desires. So if you think back to the concept of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there are the immediate biological needs and desires that must be met, such as safety and shelter and food, before somebody can meet higher desires, such as reason and intellect and love. Furthermore, when desires are approached from a purely quantitative view, it becomes increasingly hard to describe and place numbers on these higher desires, because desires such as reason, intellect, and love are often considered qualitative. You may be able to quantify how much food a person has, how safe a person has, but how do you put a number on love? You may say that we can use an IQ test to put a number on intelligence, but again, we come to this question of, is there more to intelligence than what an IQ test measures? And then we also have this concern of, if you are making these decisions, these calculations for every interaction that you have, how do you quantify an experience that is new for you? How can you quantify a higher level of desire than what you have ever yourself experienced in the past? So Bentham's utilitarianism, with the idea of quantifying happiness, really fell apart the higher the levels of happiness went. John Stuart Mills was another English philosopher, and he was actually the godson of Bentham, and he studied under Bentham. And John Stuart Mills is the individual whose name is most often associated with utilitarianism, because Mill is who really popularized utilitarianism. And instead of trying to quantify happiness, Mill, on the other hand, chose to take a more qualitative approach. According to Mill, if an individual has two choices of how to respond, the chosen of these two responses is going to be what brings the person the higher level of pleasure or happiness. So therefore, what brings you the greatest happiness is what you would freely choose to do if you had the option. And what occurred with this qualitative utilitarianism was this element of elitism, because people often choose experiences that they are familiar with. People that are unable to reach a certain level of desire, often related to reason or intellect, aren't going to choose that because they don't know to choose that. It's kind of like the idea that you think that Hershey's chocolate is really good until you have a Lindor truffle. And so you don't know what you're missing until you've tried it. And a quote that is commonly attached to Mill is this: "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool, or the pig, are of different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides." So in other words, with this level of elitism, it is better to be somebody dissatisfied knowing what you are missing out on than the person who is satisfied with what you have because you don't realize there is something better or greater. According to utilitarianism, the ultimate reality or the source of truth is that truth comes to us through our senses. If you recall, utilitarianism is an Enlightenment theory. Therefore, it is grounded in reason and logic and purposefully avoids relying on faith, coercion, or revelation. The nature of humans is that our actions should not be judged by conformity to rules, but that what makes an action good must be based on the results of our action, and that as humans, we are always going to choose the action that we believe will necessarily bring us the greatest level of happiness. Utilitarianism rejects faith as a sufficient basis for ethics. However, utilitarianism does allow room for God. It is not dependent on a belief in God, but it allows for the concept of God. And this can be inferred through the idea that if truth is discovered through our senses and observation, God also teaches us through our senses, and observation of the world can tell us what God expects of us, and this concept of, as Christians, that when we do what God intends for us, that is what brings about true happiness. To wrap up utilitarianism, happiness is the only thing that is intrinsically good, according to this ethical theory. Therefore, the only thing that is intrinsically evil is pain or unhappiness. Utilitarianism, though, fails to recognize the value of people, only the outcome of actions bringing about happiness. Utilitarianism does address that no one person's happiness is more valuable than another, and that we should seek the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. But aside from bringing about happiness, the value of individual humans is overlooked. According to utilitarianism, an action is deemed ethical based on its result. We should pursue happiness, and we analyze an action as ethical based on how much happiness it brings about. Which leads us to a question about, should results be the only measure of right or wrong? What if you partake in an act with the intent of producing happiness, however, something goes wrong and the intended happiness is not produced? Does that in and of itself make the act unethical? In our next lecture, we will discuss Kantian ethics, an ethical theory that postulates that instead of measuring morality based on the outcomes of an action, the intent behind the action should be what determines if an act was ethical.